The dialogue between Socrates and Meno begins when Meno poses the question of whether virtue can be taught. He speculates that virtue might instead arise from practice, or perhaps is something innate. Socrates responds by referencing Meno's fellow Thessalians, who have recently earned a reputation for wisdom, largely due to the growing renown of Gorgias, a prominent sophist. According to Socrates, Gorgias has taught people how to give bold and impressive answers to any question in the manner typical of experts. In contrast, Socrates explains, the Athenians do not claim such knowledge. He includes himself among the ignorant, emphasizing his own lack of understanding. For Socrates and Plato, recognizing one's ignorance is far preferable to pretending to know what one does not. Socrates' modesty, therefore, sets the stage to expose the shortcomings of Meno, Gorgias, the Thessalians, and the sophists in general during the course of the Elenchus. Socrates then adds that he has never met anyone who truly knows what virtue is, though he mentions an unclear recollection of meeting Gorgias, suggesting he cannot comment on Gorgias' knowledge with certainty. Meno is surprised by this claim and, encouraged by Socrates, attempts to define virtue. He begins by listing various kinds of virtue. For men, it includes managing public affairs, helping friends, harming enemies, and self-protection. For women, it involves household management, safeguarding property, and obedience to one's husband. He adds that there are different virtues for children, slaves, the elderly, and others. Socrates quickly points out that Meno has offered not a definition, but a catalogue of different virtues. To illustrate the problem, he compares Meno's list to a swarm of bees. The bees may vary in size or shape, but they are all still bees. Likewise, Socrates is seeking what all instances of virtue have in common, the essential nature or form, eidos, of virtue. Though this concept of forms will later become central to Plato's philosophy, here it is introduced more subtly. Plato at this point seems to conceive of forms as being somehow inherent only within things themselves, rather than existing in their own ideal state. To clarify further, Socrates uses examples like health and strength, which remain the same regardless of the person in whom they appear. Strength in a man is the same as strength in a woman, even if the degree varies, thus emphasizing the common quality underlying different expressions. Despite Socrates' efforts, Meno remains unsure of what Socrates is really after. This confusion underscores the originality of Socratic and Platonic thought, which contrasted sharply with the traditional Greek view of virtue as success in various areas of life. The idea that virtue must refer to a single, unified quality across its many applications was unfamiliar to Meno and his contemporaries, though it is far more familiar to us today. Socrates reminds Meno that no expression of virtue is valuable without moderation and justice. Meno agrees, and Socrates suggests that this points toward a shared core among all the virtues. With this in mind, Meno makes a second attempt to define virtue, proposing that it is the ability to rule over people. Socrates quickly dismisses Meno's latest definition of virtue, the ability to rule over people, by pointing out that such a trait wouldn't be considered virtuous in children or slaves. Moreover, Socrates asks whether ruling must not also be done justly in order to count as virtue. Meno agrees, affirming that justice is virtue. Socrates seizes on this, asking whether Meno means that justice is virtue itself, or merely a virtue. Meno again struggles to grasp the distinction between an example of virtue and a definition of virtue. To clarify, Socrates offers another analogy. Roundness is a type of shape, but not shape itself. Meno seems to begin understanding and revises his claim, saying that justice is one virtue among many. He proceeds to name others, like courage, moderation, wisdom, and generosity. But this third attempt again fails to define virtue as a whole. Meno has simply listed more of its forms, not defined the essential nature of virtue itself. Socrates notes this recurring mistake. They keep uncovering many virtues when trying to find just one. He returns to the earlier example of a shape versus shape, and adds the idea of color to illustrate further. When Meno asks Socrates to define shape and color himself as examples, the dialogue takes an unusual turn. It is rare in Plato's dialogues for Socrates to be asked to supply a definition. Here, this reversal allows Plato to contrast Socratic definition with the sophist's more showy approaches. Socrates first checks that Meno understands the geometrical ideas of limit and solid, and then defines shape plainly. Shape is that which limits a solid. After playfully scolding Meno for being demanding, Socrates provides a more elaborate definition of color in the style of Gorgias. Drawing on Empedocles' theory of effluvia, subtle particles that enter our sense organs, Socrates defines color as an effluvium from shapes which fits the sight and is perceived, even quoting Pindar to dramatize the point. In doing so, he contrasts his own clear, rational method with the sophist's ornate and theatrical manner of explanation. Inspired by the exchange, Meno makes a fourth attempt at defining virtue. Quoting poetry, he says that virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to acquire them. But Socrates dismantles this idea as well. First, he questions whether people truly desire bad things. Meno agrees that they do not. People pursue what they believe to be good. Socrates concludes that desiring bad things, knowing they are bad, would be irrational and self-harming. Therefore, no one knowingly desires what is bad. This leaves Meno with a revised definition. Virtue is the ability to secure good things. But even this, Socrates says, must be qualified. Such acquisition must be done justly and piously. Otherwise, it would not be virtue but vice. And once again, they're back where they started, defining virtue in terms of one of its parts, such as justice, rather than identifying what all virtues have in common. This version of the mistake is subtler than before. Meno is no longer simply listing virtues, but is now using a part of virtue to define the whole. As Socrates makes clear, a proper definition cannot include the very thing it's trying to define, or define virtue in terms that already assume an understanding of virtue. Exasperated, Meno compares Socrates to a torpedo fish, saying that contact with him has numbed both his mind and his tongue. Though he has often given speeches on virtue in front of large crowds, he now finds himself unable to say what it is. This state of bewilderment, realizing that one does not know, is a central feature of Socratic philosophy and is known as aporia, the fertile confusion from which genuine inquiry begins. Having made no progress in defining virtue, though having gained a clearer idea of what a proper definition involves, Socrates and Meno prepare to continue their investigation. But before they can proceed, Meno raises a troubling question. How will you look for virtue when you don't know at all what it is? This introduces a well-known philosophical problem, often called Meno's paradox. If you don't know what something is, how can you search for it? How will you recognize it when you find it? And how do you even know where to begin? Socrates responds with a long and somewhat unusual answer. He refers to priests and priestesses, and to wise men and women who deal with divine matters. According to these figures, the soul is immortal. It does not perish with the body, but instead has lived many lives and seen all things. Because of this, Socrates says, the soul already possesses knowledge of everything. What we call learning, then, is actually a process of recollection, remembering what the soul already knows from its previous existence. This theory, that the soul is eternal and all-knowing, is one of Plato's most influential ideas, and this passage is likely the first time it appears in his dialogues. It will become central in works like the Phaedo and the Phaedrus. Here, the theory is introduced to dissolve Meno's paradox. If learning is recollection, then seeking knowledge is not about discovering something entirely new, but about retrieving what the soul already knows. Meno is intrigued, but unconvinced. He asks Socrates to demonstrate that learning is recollection. Socrates agrees and calls over one of Meno's slaves to illustrate his point. What follows is not only a demonstration of the theory of recollection, but also a clear example of the Socratic method, or elenchus, in which Socrates leads his subject through a series of questions that reveal contradictions or ignorance in their thinking, often ending in aporia, a state of puzzlement or uncertainty. After confirming that the slave boy speaks Greek and has no prior knowledge of geometry, Socrates draws a square in the dirt, dividing it into 4 equal parts. Through simple questioning, and without teaching the boy directly, Socrates gets him to recognize that a square with an area of 4 square feet has sides that are 2 feet long. He then asks the boy to figure out the length of the side of a square with double the area, 8 square feet. The boy initially guesses that the side must be 4 feet long, simply doubling the length. But this leads to a square of 16 square feet, not 8, exposing the flaw in his reasoning. Socrates continues questioning the slave, guiding him, without offering direct instruction, to recognize his mistake. The boy now realizes that the side length he is looking for must fall between 2 feet, the correct side of the original square, and 4 feet, his incorrect guess. He proposes that the correct length might be 3 feet. But this too is wrong, since a square with sides of 3 feet has an area of 9 square feet, not the 8 he's aiming for. Socrates gently corrects this second error and highlights to Meno that the slave has now reached a state of aporia, a realization of his own ignorance. According to Socrates, this is an improvement over the slave's earlier confidence in a false answer. Referring back to Meno's own complaint of being numbed by Socratic questioning, Socrates remarks that now the slave does not know and would be glad to find out, whereas earlier he thought he could deliver impressive speeches on the subject. In short, the slave, like Meno, has actually benefited from being intellectually numbed. Socrates reminds Meno that he is only questioning the slave, not teaching him. He then builds upon the original square of 4 square feet by adding 3 more equal squares to form a larger square, 4 feet on each side, 4 times the area of the original. He draws diagonal lines connecting the midpoints of each side of this larger square and asks whether these diagonals cut the original squares in half. The slave agrees that they do. At this point, Socrates slightly bends his rule of not imparting knowledge, as his geometric setup begins to suggest rather than ask. Nonetheless, the essential point is preserved. The diagonal of the original square turns out to be the length needed to create a square with double the area. Through Socrates' continued questioning, the slave arrives at this conclusion himself, apparently without being taught. Socrates presents this as compelling evidence to support his earlier claim that learning is recollection. If no instruction was given, then the slave must have already possessed the knowledge, dormant within him, waiting to be stirred up like a dream through proper inquiry. This, for Socrates and Plato, resolves the paradox of how we can search for knowledge about something we do not yet know. Socrates encourages Meno to trust in the process of recollection. You should always try with confidence to seek out and recollect what you do not know at present, that is, what you do not recollect. Even if the theory about the soul's immortality and recollection isn't entirely accurate, the experiment with the slave shows that belief in the possibility of learning through seeking makes us better human beings. Having addressed the paradox of whether it's even possible to search for something one does not yet know, Socrates and Meno return to the question that originally sparked the conversation. Is virtue something that can be taught, acquired through practice, or is it simply inborn in certain individuals? Although Socrates again insists that one must first understand what virtue is before asking how it is acquired, he agrees, for the sake of the argument, to consider Meno's version of the question. Socrates proposes that they proceed hypothetically, much like geometers do when exploring problems. This method, he suggests, offers another way to approach an unknown. By assuming a possible solution and testing its implications, one may be led closer to the truth, just as happened in the earlier example with Meno's slave. He puts forth the first hypothesis. If virtue is a kind of knowledge, then it must be teachable. And conversely, if it is not a kind of knowledge, then it cannot be taught. The next step, then, is to determine whether or not virtue really is a kind of knowledge. To explore this, Socrates adds a second hypothesis. If there exists any good thing that is not knowledge, then perhaps virtue isn't knowledge either. But if all things that are truly good must fall under the category of knowledge, then virtue would indeed be a kind of knowledge. Working through these ideas, Socrates revisits a point he made earlier in the dialogue. Things like courage, wealth, and strength are only good when used wisely. Without understanding, these supposed goods can become harmful. Therefore, he argues, the soul's activities, its choices and its sufferings, lead to true happiness only when guided by wisdom. In this sense, the benefits of the soul, or virtue itself, appear to depend entirely on wisdom. As Socrates puts it, all that the soul undertakes and endures, if directed by wisdom, ends in happiness. This leads to a striking conclusion. If virtue is what benefits the soul, and if only wisdom ensures that benefit, then virtue must be, or at least must include, wisdom. And if that is the case, it follows that virtue is not something people are born with by nature. Excited by this reasoning, Meno concludes that if virtue is knowledge, it can indeed be taught. But Socrates is cautious. His concern isn't with the logic of the hypotheses themselves, but with the central claim that virtue is knowledge, a stronger and more specific claim than simply saying that virtue involves wisdom as a whole or in part. Socrates raises a troubling question. If virtue is something that can be taught, where are the teachers? Despite his many inquiries, Socrates says he has never encountered anyone who reliably teaches virtue. This absence of teachers suggests that, in practice, virtue may not be teachable after all. At this point in the dialogue, Anytus, an influential Athenian citizen and politician, joins the conversation. His presence provides Socrates with a new opportunity to probe whether virtue can be taught, particularly by turning to someone seen as a representative of traditional civic virtue. Socrates begins by comparing the teaching of virtue to other forms of instruction. In every craft, such as medicine or shoemaking, there are recognized experts who are paid to teach others. So, Socrates suggests, ironically, it seems, that the sophists must be the experts in virtue, since they openly claim to teach it and charge fees for doing so. Anytus is appalled at the idea. He expresses strong disdain for the sophists, accusing them of corrupting and ruining those who follow them. This sentiment was common at the time, even though the sophists were respected enough to earn a living teaching rhetoric and to enjoy public recognition. Socrates himself was later condemned in part due to his perceived resemblance to the sophists, although he opposed their methods and teachings throughout his life. Feigning surprise at Anytus's disapproval, Socrates notes that figures like Protagoras had taught for more than 40 years, achieving fame and wealth. He remarks that if these sophists truly harmed their students, such widespread success would be impossible in any other craft, so why would it be tolerated in the case of virtue? Nevertheless, Socrates says the real question isn't who can't teach virtue, but who can. Let them be the sophists if you like, he concedes, with a touch of irony. But Anytus responds by suggesting that any well-bred Athenian gentleman can serve as an example of virtue. Socrates, however, returns to the original question. Have these gentlemen been successful in passing their virtue on to their own sons? To press the issue further, Socrates brings up examples of renowned, virtuous Athenian men whose sons failed to live up to their father's excellence. He mentions Themistocles and his son Cleophantus, Pericles and his sons Perillus and Xanthippus, Aristides and his son Lysimachus, and Thucydides and his sons Milesius and Stephanus. These fathers, according to Socrates, would surely have taught their sons all they could and would have sought out the best teachers available if virtue could indeed be taught. Yet, their sons turned out to be mediocre at best. This, Socrates suggests, is evidence against the teachability of virtue. Anytus grows increasingly offended by Socrates' examples and warns him to be careful about insulting honorable men. But Socrates presses on undeterred. He turns back to Meno and asks whether any Thessalians claim to teach virtue. Meno replies that opinions in Thessaly are divided on the matter, perhaps why he posed the question to Socrates in the first place. Socrates follows up by asking whether sophists like Gorgias claimed to teach virtue. Meno replies that Gorgias never made such a claim. He only professed to teach how to speak well and persuasively. Socrates even recalls the poet Theognis, who appears similarly conflicted. He says in one poem that virtue can be taught, and in another that it cannot. Socrates asks Meno, can those who are so confused on a topic be considered reliable teachers of it? Clearly not. This brings Socrates and Meno to a troubling realization. Though they had earlier agreed that virtue is at least partly a kind of wisdom, it now seems doubtful that it can be taught, and if it cannot be taught, then it cannot truly be knowledge. This conclusion unsettles Socrates. It implies that people can succeed in life not only through knowledge, but through some other unknown means. Having reached the tentative conclusion that virtue is at least partially a kind of wisdom, Socrates and Meno, with Anytus now mostly silent, confront a paradox. Even the most virtuous men do not appear to be virtuous by virtue of knowledge, since they seem unable to teach it to others. This, Socrates suggests, might explain why their search for the nature of virtue has come up short. Perhaps, he proposes, they went wrong in looking to virtuous men as models, assuming their virtue stemmed from knowledge. This suggestion confuses Meno, prompting Socrates to clarify. Perhaps the virtuous actions of such men arise not from knowledge, but from true opinion, a kind of correct belief that, while not based on understanding, nonetheless guides action just as effectively. To illustrate, Socrates offers the example of a guide to Larissa. Whether the guide has actual knowledge of the route or simply a true opinion about it, he still leads travelers successfully. The outcome is the same either way. Meno then poses a natural question. If true opinion can be just as effective as knowledge in guiding action, why is knowledge considered superior? What makes them different? Socrates answers with a vivid analogy. Imagine a beautiful statue made by Daedalus. If it is not tied down, it is prone to wander off and cannot be kept. But if it is secured, it can be preserved and valued. In the same way, true opinions are unstable. They tend to fade from the mind unless they are tied down by an account, a reasoned explanation of why the opinion is true. When someone can provide such an account, the true opinion becomes knowledge, firmly fixed in the soul. This process, Socrates reminds Meno, is connected to the idea of recollection discussed earlier in their dialogue. Still, Socrates concedes, when it comes to making sound decisions, true opinion is just as useful in the moment as knowledge. With this clarification in mind, Socrates and Meno confront the final problem. They have agreed that virtue is neither teachable, since it is not knowledge, nor innate, since neither knowledge nor true opinion is inborn. So how then people become virtuous? Socrates does not offer a definitive answer. Instead, he suggests that virtuous individuals must receive their virtue through divine inspiration. Like prophets or soothsayers who speak truth while lacking understanding, virtuous statesmen may act rightly not because they know what is good, but because they are inspired. Their virtue, then, is a kind of gift from the gods, unaccompanied by understanding. Though this conclusion leaves the original question unresolved, it is not without philosophical value. Socrates has led Meno and Anytus, both prominent, confident men, to recognize their ignorance about virtue. Rather than ending with a neatly packaged answer, the dialogue concludes with a recognition of uncertainty, clearing the way for more rigorous and honest inquiry in the future. As the dialogue closes, Socrates bids his companions farewell, urging them to continue the search for what virtue truly is. They must, he insists, first understand the nature of virtue before asking how it arises in people. He leaves Meno with a final, perhaps ironic, suggestion, to go and teach Anytus what he has learned today.